Welcome, everyone. I wanted to share with you our collective agreement. Before we begin, inspired by the presenters of Black Reconstructions, Cities and Spatial Justice, a recent event at the Museum of Modern Art, we have prepared a collective agreement for engaging with our invited guests at the symposium. We will recognize others' right to speak from experience and make space for the voice of others. We will practice engaged listening as an act of care. We will not tolerate abusive or hateful speech. Please use the Q&A function to pose questions to the presenter. The session moderator will read the questions to the presenter at the end of the session. And please note that this session will be recorded and posted on the ICRC website.
Wonderful, thank you, Jill. Must feel good to say that for the last time. Just before I introduce this last session and a little bit more about the symposium, I want to acknowledge that Western University is located on the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Arawandran, Lenape-Wauk, and Haudenosaunee peoples, on territory connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. As the Indigenous Education Network cautioned 2 years ago at the AERA conference in Toronto, land acknowledgements must resist becoming performative, static scripts, but should instead be a call to action to reconsider what it means to be in good relations with Indigenous communities, lands, and waterways. As education scholars, educators, researchers, and activists, we want to consider carefully the possibilities for education to redress the many past and present violences enacted in the name of settler colonialism, and recognize that the acknowledgement of lands and waters is only a small part of engaging in just relations with Indigenous communities, lands, and waterways. This is the 7th of 7 times that I get to introduce the symposium. A little bit sad to be doing it for the last time. It's been a really wonderful 2 days, but just in case that you are joining us for the first time in the 7th of 7 sessions, I will talk a little bit about it. Welcome to the Curriculum and Pedagogy for Uncertain Futures Symposium, presented by the Interdisciplinary Center for Research in Curriculum as a Social Practice at the University of Western Ontario. My name is Corey Jobe, and I am a doctoral student at the University of Western Ontario in the Faculty of Education and a graduate student assistant with the ICRC. And the ICRC is a research center within the Faculty of Education at Western, comprised of both faculty and graduate student scholars who work in this collaborative community and university network to advance research in curriculum studies and to inform public policy and pedagogy in the 21st century. We are delighted to be coming together in this virtual space, and this symposium has been curated as a multidisciplinary forum for reimagining the possibilities for curriculum and pedagogy in what is a particularly salient time for this kind of speculative thinking. As I was thinking about my introductory remarks and what I might say to introduce the symposium, I was reading and thinking alongside cultural critic Olivia Laing, who in the introduction to her recent book of essays, Funny Weather, turns to the powerful speculative world-making of art to both contextualize and to look within and beyond the intensity of our collective times. And in her introduction, Laing writes, "What I wanted most, apart from a different timeline, was a different kind of time frame, in which it might be possible both to feel and to think, to process the intense emotional impact of the news, and to consider how to react, perhaps even to imagine other ways of being." And so it is in the spirit of imagining what other ways of being are possible that we have convened this multidisciplinary lineup of presentations from education scholars, artists, graduate students, and community activists to consider the role of curriculum and pedagogy for uncertain futures. Responding to the times in which we live, a world shaped in part by the ongoing climate and waste crises, anti-Black, anti-Asian, and anti-Indigenous racism, the COVID-19 pandemic, and geopolitical instabilities, just to name a few, we have oriented this symposium around the following provocations that we invite you to think with as you listen to the final presentation of the day. First, what are the possibilities for inviting speculation into curriculum studies? In the name of what are curriculum and pedagogy enacted in response to the conditions of our times? How might curriculum scholars engage with Indigenous and Black feminist studies to contest humanism and coloniality in education? And finally, in the face of 21st century challenges, how are educators, curriculum theorists, and pedagogues rethinking curriculum and pedagogy? Each session will include time at the end for questions and answers between audience and presenters, and you're invited to use the Q&A function to share your questions with the moderators, who will then facilitate this portion of the event. And we ask that you please keep our collective agreement in mind that Jill read off the top when participating in the Q&A. I would also like to recognize the collective work of the Symposium Planning Committee, comprised of graduate students and the director of the center, Tatiana Zakharova, Malvika Agarwal, Jill Dombrowski, Samia Javed, Sarah Hennessy, Courtney Niedig, Lisa Marie Gagliardi, and Veronica Psini-Ketchabah. It really was a wonderful coming together of lots of different minds. Again, I'm a little bit sad that it's over. It's been a lot of work and a lot of really wonderful thinking together over the last 2 days. If you're joining in and sharing the conversation via social media, please feel free to tag any of the Symposium Planning Committee and the presenters, and share your experiences using hashtag #UncertainFutures2021 and hashtag WorldsToCome2021. We are recording each session, and the videos will be available on our website at www.icrc.uwo.ca, and they should be up in the next couple of weeks. And I will send an email out via Eventbrite to notify you all if you're interested in revisiting some of the sessions. I'm now going to turn it over to Courtney, who will be introducing the session's presenter.
Thanks so much, Corey. And thank you to everyone for joining us, as Corey said, for our final session of the symposium. It is my pleasure to be introducing Towani Duscher this afternoon, for where I live on the traditional and treaty territories of the Tsawwassen First Nations peoples. Towani Duscher is an educator, researcher, dancer, and poet. She is a postdoctoral associate and teaches as a sessional instructor for the Workland School of Education at the University of Calgary. She also teaches as an artist in residence, teaching core curriculum outcomes through movement in elementary schools. Dr. Duscher received her doctorate from the Workland School of Education in the specialization of curriculum and learning. Her doctoral research utilized the arts-based research methods of dance, poetry, and pedagogical documentation to examine the somatic lessons that students learn from the hidden curriculum in public schooling. Her research interests includes arts-based research, hidden curriculum, education for decolonization, and anti-racist education. She is currently developing a community outreach project to support teachers, parents, and guardians for pedagogical approaches and considerations of colonizing literacy in English language arts classrooms. She has authored publications in peer-reviewed journals, including Cultural Pedagogical English and the Journal of the Canadian Association for Curriculum Studies. Towani is passionate about listening carefully to our bodies and finding ways to invite our embodied knowledge to emerge. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Towani, and I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this symposium. And I feel so honored that some of the people on the panel have shared that they've read my work. And I think that the questions you're asking are so important, and the process of us coming together is also a step towards answering them. So I'm so proud to be invited to be part of this work. I'm just going to share this. So my presentation is called Listening to the Lessons Imprinted Beneath Our Skin, an Arts-Based Commemoration Inquiry. First, I'd like to start with my own land acknowledgement, as I am presenting from Mohkinstsis, or Calgary, located on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. This includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw. The city of is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Acknowledging the land that I live and learn on guides me to be full and grounded and embodied in this place. This means acknowledging the history of this land and the history that schooling has had here. This land holds beauty and also pain, and as a Black mixed race, non-Indigenous teacher, I am responsible to both. We all stand at the nexus between what has shaped this land and beings in the past and what may come but is not yet. So attending to this place of in-between reminds me to consider how I engage in this work in a way that honors the past, hopes for the future, and attends actively to the present land, people, and beings that share this space. In thinking about the symposium's questions about possibilities for inviting speculation, rethinking curriculum and pedagogy, and contesting coloniality. Within these guiding questions, I hear the call to consider and confront the elements, processes, methods of educational research and curriculum studies that are colonized and colonizing, the ways which our approaches may continue to fragment and isolate and place knowledge and sites of knowledge on a hierarchy. Through my doctoral research, I tried to confront and work to disrupt the hierarchies in our taken for granted understandings of schooling. Decolonizing or uncolonizing our thinking and our processes is ongoing work, as many of us are working in languages that our ancestors were forced through colonization, and we have embodied colonized understandings of what counts as knowledge and learning through our own schooling. What I try to do in my own work is confront my own embodied assumptions, open a space for stepping off the ladder of hierarchies, and create a space for each person to be seen, valued, and cared for. Today, I plan to share my process and the methods that I use to examine the somatic lessons that students learn from the hidden curriculum of schooling, because this work was also uncolonizing work for me as well. Colonization works to control and limit society by fragmenting what we learn and how we connect to each other, to the land, and to our bodies of knowledge. Through colonization, we are taught to place things on a hierarchy rather than see the interconnected circle that values each of us. In creating a murmuration of arts-based inquiry methods, I aim to make a space for interconnection in my research. In doing this work, I was guided by the South African philosophy of Ubuntu, meaning I am because we are. This is an ethic of interdependence that reminds us that we are all interconnected with each other and with the planet. My actions impact you and yours mine. By engaging in educational research with a focus on Ubuntu, I work to dwell in these interconnections and attend to the lessons I could learn from every place, space, and body. My work aims to be an expression of Ubuntu. As Litseka explained, Ubuntu articulates our interconnectedness, our common humanity, and the responsibility to each that flows from our connection. I should note, I also reference police brutality in this presentation, and there are parts of this presentation that may be triggering. My doctoral research began with Eric Garner. The hermeneutic scholars Mools, McCaffrey, Field, and Lang explain that there are moments of aletheia in our lives, moments of truth where what was once concealed is suddenly revealed. My moment of aletheia was seeing the murder of Eric Garner in 2014. Eric Garner was a Black man who was tackled by police in broad daylight on the street in New York. One of the officers held Mr. Garner in a chokehold until he suffocated. The video of his death was publicly broadcast across North American television. His last words were, "I can't breathe." His death challenged me to question what I've learned, what my children are learning, and how the world will be different going forward. And I wondered, can it be anything but a repetition of the past if we do not confront the multiple ways that we perpetuate racism and oppression, the ways we perpetuate a fragmented worldview, engaging in a fractal that continues to repeat itself over and over again. I wrote the following poem. Fractals. I was on the treadmill when I watched Eric Garner die. The gym was filled with people. We all kept doing what we were doing while the video of a man dying, 4 men pressing his life out with their uniformed knees, choking the life out of his Black body, looped over and over and over. And no one stopped what they were doing. No one seemed shocked or upset. The video kept looping. The track on the treadmill kept going. I kept taking steps to nowhere, walking and walking forward, ending up in the same place I started. Each step looped images and videos in my mind. Trayvon Martin, Rodney King, Martin Luther King Jr., 4 little girls, unnamed bodies hanging from trees, suffocated bodies packed in on boats. Each step forward on the cyclical track looped back in time, step after step in the name of progress, getting nowhere, repeating the same actions, the same beliefs, a mathematical fractal, a never-ending pattern, infinitely complex patterns that are self-similar across different scales, created by repeating a simple process over and over in an ongoing feedback loop. We don't need to loop. The treadmill has a big red stop button in case you fall or can't keep up, in case you can't breathe. But we choose to stay in the loop. We send children to school to learn. Our schools teach them the reports as citizen development character, yet we seem to end up in the same place we started, looping. Every generation of students learning to loop, every generation of teachers teaching in the fractals, unaware of the looping track, teaching infinitely complex patterns, repeating simple processes over and over in an ongoing feedback loop. The video keeps looping. The track on the treadmill keeps going, taking steps to nowhere, ending up in the same place we started. When I watched Eric Garner die, I was on the treadmill in an ongoing feedback loop, in an ongoing feedback loop, in an ongoing feedback loop. Last year, the world watched as George Floyd was killed in the street, and I felt myself trapped by that fractal again. And this week, we are confronted with footage of the murder of Dante Wright and the 13-year-old Adam Toledo, and I'm left asking the same questions that started my research. Schools are sites of learning that are shaping children into citizens. And I must ask myself, what are we doing to perpetuate this violence? How are schools as sites of teaching and learning contributing to perpetuating this oppression? What are we doing in schools? And how are we as educators responsible for the oppression that continues from generation to generation as a fractal of pain? How can we examine not only the lessons we teach through the explicit curriculum, but how do we attend to the impact of the hidden and the null curriculum as well? What are students learning from participating in school? My concerns about this fractal, the hypnotic, ongoing feedback loop embedded in education directed me to examine the hidden curriculum. I know that schools are not overtly writing racism and division as explicit outcomes, although they seem to be trying to do that in Alberta. And yet these issues are still prevalent in our society. In writing about the hidden curriculum of schools, Apple and King noted that the study of the relationship between ideology and school knowledge is especially important for understanding the larger social collectivity of which we are all a part. It enables us to begin to see how a society reproduces itself, how it perpetuates its conditions of existence through the selection and transmission of certain kinds of cultural capital upon which a complex yet unequal industrial society depends, and how it maintains cohesion among its classes and individuals by propagating ideologies that ultimately sanction existing institutional arrangements that can cause unnecessary stratification and inequality in the first place. This passage reminds me that school and society shape each other in their interconnection. Ubuntu, the school is because we all are. We all are because the school is. Thus, the materials and methods that we use in schooling children are reflected out into the society as the students carry lessons from schooling out into the world. We often assess what students know about the curriculum outcomes in the explicit curriculum, but we rarely, if ever, attend to the lessons they embody from the hidden and null curriculum, the lessons taught through the way we organize and structure schooling, learning, assessment, and engagement. Eisner argued that these are some of the most important lessons that students learn. So how are we attending to these lessons that shape both students and society? I'll share my process of engaging in arts-based research to both dwell in the topic of schooling and invite students to allow their embodied knowledge to surface. This process started by listening to my own students, then using my method to understand my own somatic knowledge. Finally, I developed a method that I used in my doctoral research. Dance, I've always turned to the body for understanding. To understand the impact of the curriculum on students and their learning, engaging in arts-based research and inquiry offered me opportunity to their embodied knowledge to surface in a way that we could examine and attend to it. Arts-based inquiry offers an opportunity to use multiple artistic methods and ways of knowing, allowing each of the methods to shape and speak to the others. Students are not always aware of their somatic knowledge they carry within their bodies, and arts-based research is an effort to extend beyond constraints of discursive communication in order to express meanings that otherwise would be ineffable. Planning that we know we can tell. Words and knowledge and experience. Through arts-based inquiry practices, I open a space for students to express their knowledge from a different point of view via the body. Arts-based inquiries honor the body as not simply flesh and bones, but instead as a living enactment of culture and social beliefs, as Kantian and Snober expressed. And Springay and Friedman explain that arts-based research understands the body as meaning, as opposed to a container in which we store or put meaning, problematizing the relations between inside and outside. Arts-based inquiry seeks to draw our attention and calls on researchers to listen to more than words. Weeb and Snober explained, living with and through our senses is the place for us to gently rock into ways of being which call us to attention, to mindful listening. And what we would suggest is that this is a bodyful listening, a listening with our bodies. The call to the poetic beckons us as creatures in this world to listen to all of life as a place for the echoes, silences, yawns, and sighs, to be a sacred space to embrace the curriculum of life. Our skin has a language unto itself. All we need to do is listen. We can listen with our eyes to what students are embodying from participating in school. I teach as an artist in residence, and I teach core curriculum outcomes through movement. One year I worked in an elementary school teaching grade 5 students, and we explored their understandings of immigration. And I asked the students to brainstorm words that represent reasons why people leave their homes to come to Canada. This was based on information that they had learned from their interviews with their families and friends. Then I asked them to quickly create frozen shapes as a group to represent one of the words. And students created breathtaking, complex images of immigration. Some students chose the word education. They knew that people immigrated to Canada so their children could be educated in a Canadian school. And the students' shapes revealed a complexity of implicit understandings and definitions of schooling. One group had students all at different levels, from laying down to seated to standing, all in a forward progression. And the entire tableau created the shape of an arrow guided by and culminating in the teacher who was standing at the front. The difference in levels between the teacher and students, the difference in relationships, some close and some far from the front, all revealed ideas about power and progress that were embedded in the students' definitions of schooling. Some students were grouped and some were alone, and this spoke about community and isolation to me. They shared a complexity of ideas that I'm not sure that they were even aware of when making the shapes. The students told stories about power, progress, community, isolation, teaching, and learning that I'm not sure they could have explained through words alone. They presented an exhibition of stories. Exhibition of stories. Their bodies tell the stories. Channeling the knowledge of their ancestors, they become mediums, old stories emerging through young bodies. Generations of experiences speaking through levels, arms, legs, fingers, facings, moving through this medium of movement, this exhibit of bodies. I hear the stories through my eyes, stories louder could be told, exhibiting insight beyond. The body knows, the body learns, and the body remembers. Thomas Hanna explained that there are ways in which our somatic selves can obtain information about our environment. One way is for this information to be imprinted within us, taught to us after our birth, during the course of the individual development of our lives. This is ontogenetic information. This embodied knowledge informs our cognitive understandings in ways that we are not always aware of, in ways that we cannot always express with words, in ways that we do not often access, record, or assess in school and in planning for schooling. Accessing the somatic lessons that live beneath the skin required me to listen closely to the body, to allow the body to speak its own language through its own soma. I witnessed the complexity of understandings that emerged when I asked students to represent complex ideas through movement, and this brought my topic and my method together, as I realized that using movement as an interview had the potential to bring students' embodied lessons to the surface. Intrigued by this idea, I decided to further explore the act of allowing the body to speak its knowledge, and by asking my own body about the lessons I have embodied from school. I explored the somatic knowledge that I personally carry imprinted within me, and I first used bilateral tapping to tap into my physical tactile memories of schooling. This process allowed me to dwell in my memories of school and see them from different perspectives, focus in on the tactile elements of these memories. I recorded the stories that emerged from this tapping and examined them for emergent themes. I then danced the thematic concepts that emerged from these memories to understand them from the viewpoint of the body. An example of this work that leaking out. Grade 2. Ms. Persanoff was mean. She never smiled. She was always mad. One day she said, "That's it. No one can go to the bathroom until your work is finished. Don't even ask to go until your work is finished." My work wasn't finished. I crossed my legs, I squeezed my legs, I shifted in my seat, I shifted my weight up on one bum cheek while trying to finish my work. If I could just finish my work quickly, then I could go to the bathroom. Then it just leaked out. Slowly, quietly, it leaked out until I was sitting in a puddle of urine, still pretending to do my work. No one knew. I just sat there, wondering what to do now. Sitting in a puddle of shame, wet and cold. I finally raised my hand and said, "There's water in my seat." The kids all looked. James, the littlest boy in our class, came over to investigate. He put his nose right down close to my chair and said, "It smells like pee." "No," I denied, "it's just water." "Well, how did it get there?" "I don't know, it's just there." Everyone knew what it was, but I don't remember anyone teasing me about it. There felt like an unvoiced agreement that, yep, sometimes that happens. Sometimes it just leaks out. To dance the concept of leaking out, I found an old school desk. It was a desk, I searched and searched, and I found this desk that looked exactly like the kind of desk that I sat in when I was in elementary school. And I created several pieces with this, and I danced as the desk as my partner, representing my relationship with school. So I'd like to share that. After I danced the act of leaking out, I noticed that in the days following that I was covered in bruises, like they were all over my legs and arms. The act of being fluid within a restricted desk, the act of being human within a restrictive system often results in bruising, bruised egos, humiliation, a feeling of shame of being a human being. I wrote this poem, Leaking Out. Weighted pressure to regulate my body behavior, my body, my basic human instincts. Regulate, learn to sleep, eat, drink, play, think, rest, and socialize on a schedule. As first, it is fun to rebel against rigidity. Then shame covered me in bruises, blue, yellow, purple marks of underlying constant failure. This process helped me to see the potential of my proposed research. I discovered that the insights into the lessons I have learned from the hidden curriculum were unique to my own experience and at the same time spoke to universal lessons that schools teach because of the unexamined rituals of schooling that we take for granted as a definition of school. When I talked about this piece to other people and I mentioned that I had peed my pants at school, almost every single person I met shared, oh yeah, I peed my pants at school. Yes, I peed my pants at school. And I think that there's something really important about the fact that this is an experience that many of us share, and we can attend to what is the lesson that we're learning about our bodies and our humanity through these experiences. I thought about what are the somatic lessons that students carry away from the hidden curriculum of mandatory public schooling. I developed what I call a murmuration of arts-based methods. A murmuration of starlings can be tens of thousands of birds flying in unison, sensing and responding to each other, not through direct instruction or hierarchy or leadership, but through their connection, is what ornithologists think. They think that the 5 birds are sensing around it, and then it continues on into this massive like a murmuration of things. The multiple arts-based methods together, forming each other, painting pictures of something that we can see ourselves reflected in and challenging us to see schooling differently or with more clarity sometimes. So I worked with 2 groups of students, 1 class of high school students and 1 class of grade 4 students. First, we danced together using dance as a form of hermeneutic interview. Then we reflected on the dance with pedagogical documentation. And finally, the students transformed their reflections into found poetry. Through each of these artistic experiences, the students and I circled the topic of school. I began this process by asking the students to create frozen tableau shapes that represent the word school. Then each class collectively choreographed a dance about school. They performed their school dance multiple times to different music for me and for each other. I video recorded their dancing and photographed their frozen school shapes. And the next week we engaged in Reggio Emilia inspired pedagogical documentation together. So pedagogical documentation, using the process of photographing, videotaping, and note-taking around the process and product of student work, helped the students' learning to be visible. Engaging, reflecting, and commenting on the documentation of their own expression knowledge invites them into a metacognitive dialogue around their own process and understandings. Pedagogical documentation, one way I tried an opportunity for students to experience their own agency and with respect to demonstrating what they know and learning from what they have demonstrated. Moles, McCaffrey, Field, and Lang also explained that hermeneutic listening is a listening right behind your eyes, which requires watchfulness, openness, and searching to find a truth in what the other is saying. I engaged the students in this type of listening, and in the process, I listened to them. Using Reggio Emilia inspired documentation, the students and I actively listened for the truth in their movement expressions. Edwards, Gandini, and Foreman explained that pedagogical documentation allows us to make the familiar seem unfamiliar, to make invisible assumptions and values more visible, and to make explicit the thoughts that are largely tacit. In this way, documentation can be a hermeneutic form of listening, as through these acts of observation, the students and I listened for the truth in their work. What did it say about schooling, its purpose, and lessons? This form of listening is interpretive. As Worm wrote, in addition to being a process of observation, it is already an interpretation. What I observe is already a possible indication which may confirm or refute my theories or hypotheses. I shared the photos and videos of their dancing with the students. While they looked at the photos and videos and reflected on their own dancing, I asked them to comment on what they saw in their movement, and I audio recorded their commentary. The next day, I played the students' audio recorded comments and discussion back for them and asked them to make notes of the words and phrases that they heard that stood out to them from the audio. And finally, I invited students to use their notes to create found poetry. The students reflected on their own notes, underlying words and phrases that stood out to them, and shaped these notes into poetry. Some of the students shared their poetry with each other. In the Dance 25 high school class, the students performed some of their poems before their dance. And when we had a discussion about how did that change what we saw out of the dance. I also used this narration in my analysis. So I reflected on the student dance, the notes and poetry, and I looked for themes to emerge that would teach me about the lessons that students embody from participating in school. To understand these themes through the body, I invited a small group of adult dancers to dance the concepts with me. We danced the concepts and then discussed how they felt in our bodies, and I video recorded this dancing and discussion. Finally, I reflected on the interconnections between the student dance and poetry, the adult dance and commentary, and my own physical, emotional, and psychological reactions to the circling of this topic. Through poetic inquiry, I attended to the lessons that were revealed to me in this artistic process of dwelling in the topic of school. This arts-based research allowed me to see the lessons that schools teach, the lessons that I have participated in, the lessons I have been shaped by, and how these lessons have the potential to change us as citizens and as parts of society. I gathered the dance and the poetry in an arts memoration, I called it, that invites the viewer, the reader, to participate in making choices in the direction of the work and making interpretations of what you read and see. There were several challenges to this method as well. The first one was ethics. The ethics board was very uncomfortable with video recording the students dancing. And this was a central part of my work because it was the way that it allowed students to make their learning visible. So the process that I did use to explain that is I created a document about pedagogy documentation and how that was an important part for the students' learning. It wasn't only for me. I also separated the residency from the research so everyone could participate. And because this is the kind of work that I do, that schools hire to do as well, that was a lovely way that I could also feel like giving something to school. So all of the students participated in a residency program, right? Then the students that wanted to give consent with their parents consented to have their videos and photography and poetry used as part of the data for the research. And I also used a filter that helped to create, to keep their identities anonymous. Another challenge was that it was really focused on respecting the students and the teachers' time. And I was coming to the work first and foremost as an educator. So I really focused on that residency part and making sure that every single person was valued and engaged throughout. And that works if you come in as a researcher, then you think about it slightly differently. Some of the music was tricky to get the permission to use the final music. And I wanted, as I danced with the students, for them to make choices in the music as well. And some of the high school students would often share music that they wanted to try. And so we would use that music, but it wasn't always the music that we could get permission to share in the end. And then also to think about and express how dance can be used as a process. Dance as performance requires the choreographer and dancers to clean the dance. But using dance as an interview is process-based. So the strength and the knowledge emerges from paying attention to what comes out instinctively. Cleaning might make the dances prettier, and you might point your toe when you saw that it wasn't pointed, but it also would have cleaned away many of the lessons that I saw in the dance, many of the things that the student dances revealed to me. And I learned that nothing is nothing, everything is something. Every single thing that you notice, that you like or you dislike about what you see or what you experienced, and the experiences we had even after we danced, all were parts of the learning. They all revealed things that I could think about and see the truth in what it was saying about schooling and about that hidden curriculum. Everything that we did, that we felt, and that we remembered was something that taught me to see schooling with more clarity. So I'd like to share some of the findings that emerged. I'm going to start with this poem from one of the grade 4 students. I will challenge you and invite you to see me laughing, looking into your soul. This really just encapsulates the essence of this whole project for me, because it was an invitation that our children and these students allowed me and invited me to see them looking into what I do, also looking into my own soul. And it invites us all to look in their bodies, and their poetry and their movement invites us to look into the soul of schooling as well. The research revealed lessons of living in paradox. The students dancing revealed lessons about the difference between feeling seen and feeling surveillance. There were no times in the dancing, in the images or the dancing, when any of the teacher roles ever looked directly at the students in the eyes, not one time. And so there was this sense that it made me reflect on the way that students there's a lot of surveillance that Foucault speaks about, but maybe they don't always feel seen. They revealed lessons about knowing the slowness of love and needing that slow love paired with not having enough time, and also questions about the role of resistance in schooling. They also revealed lessons about leveling and hierarchy related to false narratives of progress and success. And I'd like to share a few snippets of the leveling I saw and experienced. So these are a couple of the poems that the students wrote as, I call them movement maps. So they're Sanquin poems, and the students choose all of the words. The one on the left is written by the grade 4 students, and the one on the right is written by the high school students. So what they did is they created this poem, and then they used these words to help them shape the choreography that they then created about school. So school, cool, friendly, learning, teaching, helping. School can teach you education. And then school, long, stressful, teaching, learning, laughing, a place of growth, home. In many of the students' school tableau shapes and in their school choreography, I witnessed them represent different levels, and those levels were often connected to power. In this image, we can see that there are 3 dancers who are on a lower level on their knees with their hands pointed and their facings directed towards the person in the center, who has their hands up on their head, almost in a spiky crown. The students commented that they knew who the teacher was in the shapes because they were the one who was on a higher level. They were standing up. The students explained that the top one is the teacher. The next one down is the special helper, and the bottom ones are the students. So the lowest level of of beings in their images were always the students. Sometimes the students had turned themselves into the furniture of the classroom, and that the whole another presentation, but thinking about how do we experience when we don't feel seen, how do we become like the furniture of the room, of the furniture of the school itself. Again, we can see the teacher and this repetition of the pointed finger, that one pointed finger going one direction. And again, that pointed finger, and we see these levels of students and teacher, and these representations of how we have power and control in these images that the students chose when they were asked, show me a picture of school. Many times they represented learning as a change in their physical level. So many times in their choreography, when they were asked to show learning, it involved this going up and down, up and down, up and down in both of the classes. The learning was often represented by an immediate drop in level. So going from the bottom to the top and then back again. A lot of the high school students quoted Drake and said, we started from the bottom, now we're here. But then there was always this demolishing, being built up and then being demolished, that a phrase that they repeated repeatedly in their reflections. It made me consider the ways in which schools engage in leveling and levels associated with power. These observations caused me to consider the ways that schools teach students a hierarchical worldview. The students have revealed a notion that hierarchies are a way of life, and their position on the hierarchy is always at risk of dropping. School, a crowd of people, fear, joy, full of emotions, colorful, meeting new people, saying goodbye to others. We can get built up and torn down. We get up stronger, it's a mess. It's an adventure. What would you change? Friendship, a quiet hand, bullying different, Borad bad, diplomat science, mind controlling. Friendship shapes around the same filters, teachers there, souls, heaviness rolling. The act of leveling students may be a convenient approach to organizing large groups of children. However, placing students in a hierarchy also has an important impact on how they see themselves and the world as well. Learning to view the world on a ladder leads us to always see someone else beneath us. Dancing this concept led me to fear falling down on the ladder, and I felt pressured to push others down to keep myself up. Sidanius and Prado's work on social dominance theory identified hierarchy as the foundation of oppression, and hierarchy enhancing myths or false narratives is the inaccurate stories that society tells to maintain the hierarchies that benefit some while oppressing others. This work challenged me to question how I have been complicit in promoting and supporting hierarchy enhancing, legitimizing false narratives in the classrooms as both a student, a parent, and a teacher. How has the curriculum, the hidden curriculum of hierarchy in classrooms facilitated a hierarchical worldview that leads to my own oppression as a woman of color? And how do classroom decisions contribute to the hierarchy that suffocated Eric Garner? I reflected on the hierarchy enhancing, legitimizing stories that shape the world, stories that are taken for granted and embedded in the schooling that I have been a part of. I paired this poem about myths and stories with the video of the adult dancers dancing levels.
March through progress, from monkey to man. Progress takes a linear, forward-moving path to improvement. Grade 12 students are more fully formed than grade 1s. Success is moving up. Black people were just not present in Alberta's history. South Asian people were not present in Alberta's history. Africa is a country. We can sum up all of the countries in Africa by saying, in Africa, because they're all the same. Knowledge has a white face. A healthy diet needs meat and dairy. Black people are only victims or survivors. Indigenous people are only victims or survivors. The buffalo just disappeared. Stories are made of heterosexual relationships. knowledge was formed in a male body. There are levels of thinking. 4 is better than 3. We don't need to define better. Reading is leveled, and so are books. Evolution means things improved. Talking about sex is dirty and needs a permission slip. Listening means being quiet. Success means having the right answers. Value is measured in awards. We don't need to know where our food comes from. Only the Americans engaged in slavery. Racism is over. Hard work can get you anywhere you wish to go. The program of studies includes everything that is important to know. Slavery is over. Europeans discovered Canada. Me to we means collecting money to buy pencils. Because, the school tells my daughter, they don't have pencils in Africa. There are only 2 genders. White men are successful only because they worked hard. Writing and reading English are the most valuable ways to communicate. That is why they are the only ways that we assess. First world countries, third world countries, developed world, developing countries, march through progress from monkey to man.
I saw and experienced the impact of this leveling. It made me see school differently. It made me see the curriculum differently. I see the way the students recreated oppression in their representation of schooling by attending to their movement and poetry, and by dancing the concept of leveling and hierarchy I now see the multiple ways that schools teach students to believe that some lives matter more. I see the ways that levels and lessons in hierarchy are embedded in our language, in our assessment, in the content we teach, and the content we don't explicitly teach. These all contribute to teaching students that leveling and hierarchy are natural instead of social constructs designed to oppress and control. I saw the similarities between the image the grade 4 students created of school and the image of Eric Garner's Last Breath. The students said it was about anti-bullying, but they centered the violence, not the love. They created an image of leveling and power, and this violence gave them an opportunity to help, to feel good about themselves. But the image of schooling needed the violence and the leveling to create a feeling of being good. They could have shown just love, but they didn't. These things are important. It is not enough to be simply aware of these things. When we become aware of something being there, we have a responsibility to that aletheia. When something opens to us, we are now connected to what has been revealed, and we have a responsibility to it. We cannot or should not conceal it, as we have been trusted with this knowledge. This research made me aware of my responsibilities. As I engage with students, I consider the lessons that the dancers and the poets from this murmuration have taught me. These are new lessons I wish to embody, somatic lessons that I hope to infuse into the hidden curriculum of my own classrooms. I work very carefully now to consider the choices I make in my classrooms and attend to how my choices in language, in class structure, and approaches to assessment and focus are hierarchy attenuating and teaching interconnection and love. I try to center my teaching around love, not just a niceness, but a complex, encompassing sense of building relationships with each other and the world through love, and the love of the disciplines and the love of each other. Love that makes us feel responsible for each other and the world. With love as the intended outcome, I hope to open a space for my students to have the time to fall in love with the interconnection between themselves and the world, not fragmented and leveled, but slowly opening through them. I hope for my students to experience love, not as an act of rebellion, but as an act of humanity. Ubuntu, I am, because we all are. Thank you.
Wow, Towani, that was what a treat. I have to start by saying, I know we had spoke previously that some of us here on the panel had the honor to read your article and to see those movements come alive on the screen. I have to say, at a lot of points, I found myself with a lump in my throat. And my heart would get a little faster, especially with speaking to the murmurations of the starlings. And my hands were getting sweaty, and I felt myself not uncomfortable, but really it was affecting me. It was really affecting me. And I didn't feel like I was just sitting in my kitchen, you know, in BC on a Zoom call. It really, I don't know how to articulate, and I think that's okay. But I felt these waves of different, my body really reacting to what you were expressing. So thank you for that very much.
Thank you. I think that paying attention to our embodied reactions are important, and it's not always that we can understand them immediately, but thinking back and paying attention to how we react to the world and to what we know and to what we're understanding, for me has always been really important. That process of just close paying attention to the students and to my own experiences.
Well, and I think I literally ran out of paper. Like, I have so many things I'd like to get into, but I also don't want to take all the air out of the room. So I'll start with, it's a comment and questions from one of our attendees, and they say, "Hi, Towani, standing ovation for you. Your presentation and work has touched me so deeply. I can't explain. Almost wish I could dance it out. Haha." My son, should. Right? Yeah, you know, maybe have a dance party, I think. My son experienced something just as you described in your story, Dance, a poem of leaking out. It hurt my heart so much. A few times in your presentation, tears sprung up. Thank you for sharing. You have inspired me so much. So I'm not alone in this. Even just reading that comment, I found myself having to take a moment to sort of swallow there, because, you know, and Vanessa Andriotti spoke to this a little bit in her conversation with the denial of violence in education. And you touched on it a little bit when beforehand we were speaking, but also to quote you, the cleaning of lessons to create something pretty. And I'm just wondering if you could take us into that a little bit more, because, you know, you did speak to your challenges so much in a research domain, but what are sort of the struggles or tensions in your processes between those romantic notions of the arts as mere self-expression or an act of beautification with what you are trying to provoke and illuminate and unsettle in education?
Thank you. That is such a great question. And I think it's something that we're struggling with arts-based research, because there is that part of it that needs to be, is an aesthetic, right? And we're thinking about what is the aesthetic of this. And I think that arts-based research offers us an opportunity to use art to not only express what we know and what we see, but also as that process. And as we engage in it as a process of letting our knowledge bubble to the surface, right? There's things that we are carrying. And when we engage in the arts, we have an opportunity for that knowledge to bubble to the surface. And so in that work of using it as a process, we have to really do that paying attention, that kind of hermeneutic listening for the truth in what the other is saying, and the truth in what we are saying as well, as we allow those expressions to be the first expressions that come out. Because there are many ways that we learn to edit ourselves and our work to make it pretty, to make it acceptable, to make it what people are expecting. And I think that that's, for this work, in terms of looking at the students dancing, there were many times, and the students were like, oh, it's messy, and there's these parts. And there were times where the high school students didn't like the blocking that they had chosen. And we talked about, instead of saying, okay, let's fix the blocking, we said, what's the story behind why don't you like it? And they said, well, there are many people that we can't see. And I was like, so what is that is there anything true about that, about school? And they all said, yeah, there's so many students like that we don't see. And it was interesting and fascinating because in the high school students, they had presented different disciplines, and all of the athletes were really centered in their dancing. And then there were these other kind of artistic groups these were the students they were talking about on the stage, that they were students that you couldn't see. And so if we had cleaned that and fixed it and made it, pretty, we would have lost the lesson about, are there places and people that the school that aren't being visible in our schools? And so that's, I just think part of listening to our bodies is not just fixing them, because when we're fixing them, I think we're also shaped by our societal expectations, and we all have learned all of those lessons. So part of it is sitting and dwelling in the uncomfortable bits, right? The parts that we can't quite express it in this one moment. But the process I found of looking at the photos and commenting and listening to our own commentary and making that into found poetry was a lovely way of just dwelling in our own experiences in a different way, and not cleaning all the lessons out, but letting them reveal themselves.
Yeah, I'm picking up on something, and forgive me if this is my own interpretation, but I'm going back to the article Seeking Race, Finding Racism, because a lot of what you're speaking to here today also is from that project. And there was a quote in there that you say, you speak to the taken for granted rituals of school. And I'm wondering, now that we're sitting in this conversation, if we could almost look at our reactionary need to fix as one of those rituals in schools. And I'd like to weave it in then with a question from one of the attendees, which would be, and I know we're talking about bodily movement, and you even spoke to how spoken ways of being don't always have to be the first or the best or the top ways of expressing, but how might poetry or the articulations and qualities of poetry inspire or enliven curriculum studies other ways that could potentially resist or push us away from these rituals of fixing? If it can, I don't know, I'm just really meshing things here together because yeah.
I found I used a lot of poetry in my dissertation, and I used it in my lit review. And one of the things that when I think about poetry is that it can disrupt our expected rhythms, right? And so we have like a rhythm that is that kind of expected ritual of school, that it has a certain rhythm, and when we engage in poetry, we have these breaks, we have ruptures in line, and we have different ways of stopping, pausing, thinking about, and opening a space around our ideas and around our expressions that disrupts that kind of expected rhythm, and it allows for like a syncopated rhythm, the way James Brown created a syncopated rhythm, right, as the soundtrack to the civil rights movement in the United States in the 60s and 70s. So I feel that poetry allows us to have that kind of syncopation, and it has that pauses, and it allows us to stop and think about things in a different way. And so I think it's interesting to think about, like, what are those rhythms of our expected research and our schooling and our lives that we continue on, and what happens when we disrupt them. And I think that poetry is a lovely way that we can be invited to disrupt things in a way that allows to open that space around them.
Well, I'm wondering if this what you're speaking to might move in well with another question, and this person thinking with Fagile Numalo's refusal of colonialism through curriculum studies, but through the body. And so you're seeing these interruptions, right? They interrupt our expectations, or perhaps our taken for granted positions of the all-knower, the pointed finger, the fixer, the gatekeeper, perhaps. So I'm wondering, how might curriculum studies refuse colonialism through the body?
I think if we look if we look at the role that colonialism has had and how we have controlled our bodies, it's been like an act of also controlling our bodies in terms of how we express ourselves, how we engage with our culture, how we move in the world. And it continues to be informing us and changing us and telling us what is an acceptable way of moving. And so when we attend to our humanness and we allow ourselves to be fully human, we also allow an opportunity for us to connect with each other and to see ourselves more fully, not only that we're these, everyone talks about those floating heads, but that our full bodies get to be part of the room and part of what we value as knowledge. And I think that that's one of the reasons why many cultures around the world include dance as an important part of the way that we express knowledge and understand things. And yet dance is one of the least used and understood elements of research. And so returning to the bodies allows us to each return to our own body of knowledge, right? That I can only dwell in this form that I have here, and you can only dwell in your form. But through that expression, we can also see the similarities and the connections between ourselves. I think that that's one of the things that was interesting about paying attention to my tactile memories, was the story of leaking out, and the story of, I also had other stories of getting my period, and that, like, this, all these stories of my humanness leaking out at school and teaching me a sense of shame. And so by sharing them, they weren't just my stories. They were stories that many people that I spoke to could connect with. And so there is that sense of disrupting the control that we have on the narrative of what it means to be a human being, and letting that open up and allow space for all of us. Right? There's also a limitation in terms of race and gender, in terms of which bodies are allowed. And so I think that that's an important part of the work that we do, is allowing our full bodies of knowledge and our full humanness to be part of our work.
Well, Towani, thank you so much. I think that's just such a beautiful note to leave not only your presentation on, but the whole symposium. It has been an absolute delight. I know all of us in every session, it pains us to have to, wrap it up. And I just really hope that all of these conversations and this time that we've been able to spend together is not a conclusion, but it really has just opened up a lot of conversations and entryways in otherwise ways of being together and in our practice. So I just really sincerely would like to thank you. And there is just a final comment of deep gratitude from the audience, just saying that what you've inspired today has just been very inspirational and just very touching. And I genuinely thank you for sharing all those intimate moments of your life with us.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, I think, and thank you for doing this work, right? For starting these conversations and bringing us all together. It's something that makes me feel hopeful about the world, even when we sometimes don't have a lot to be hopeful about. But this work makes me feel hopeful, and connecting with you makes me feel like hopeful about what we can do and how we might go forward differently. So thank you very much. And thank you all for attending the session.
Thank you, Towani. That seems like a really lovely way to end it. Thank you to everybody who was able to stay on till the very end. I'll stop the recording now.